All right, let's dive into a really fascinating and honestly pretty provocative argument. The idea that the status of women isn't just a social issue, but a hard data indicator, a technical warning that a state is about to fail. So yeah, let's get into it.
Right off the bat, the source material for this analysis makes one thing crystal clear. This isn't about feelings or ideology or what's right and wrong. It frames the entire issue as a cold, hard calculation. It's about systemic architecture. The argument is simple. When a state starts to systematically suppress women, it's a technical sign of an impending system crash.
So, the whole idea here hangs on this metaphor, the canary in the coal mine. You know the story. Miners would bring these birds down with them to detect invisible, deadly gases. If the canary stopped singing, it was a warning to get out fast. Well, this analysis says the status of women's rights is exactly that. It's the earliest, most reliable warning sign of a deep structural rot inside a country. When this canary goes silent, you'd better pay attention.
So, what happens when that canary stops singing? Well, according to the source, the fallout isn't random at all. It's actually predictable, and it tends to fall into three very distinct categories, which are called the Three Horsemen of System Default.
And there you have it. This is the absolute core of the argument. The suppression of women is a direct precursor to one of these three massive failures. It's not a question of if it will happen, but which one it's going to be. And the key point is, this isn't some coincidence. The source argues it's a direct mechanical result of a deeply flawed system design.
Okay, to really get why this happens, we have to look under the hood at how these systems are actually built. The source uses this great analogy from software development. It's about looking past the flashy user interface to see the actual back-end code that's running the whole program.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. This slide breaks down the messaging. The UI, the user interface, that's the public story, the excuse. It could be religion or tradition or family values. But the backend, the actual goal, is always the same. It's about creating a power hierarchy, controlling resources, and making sure everyone falls in line. The UI can change, but the backend objective, that never does.
So how do they build this thing? The source lays out this three-step playbook. First, you create a mirror vertical of power. Basically, if a man is taught to be the absolute authority at home, he's going to be totally fine with an absolute authority running the state. Second, you outsource all the messy social stuff, caring for kids, the elderly, the sick. You put all of that on women, for free. This creates what the source calls a free social shock absorber. And third, with all that money you just saved on things like healthcare and education, you pour it straight into the military and the police.
But, you know, like any piece of shoddy code, this whole architecture is just riddled with bugs. And I'm not talking about small glitches. These are critical, system-crashing bugs that basically guarantee it will fail every single time. Let's look at why this model is just completely unsustainable.
The first bug? It's just simple, brutal math. When you sideline half your population, you are voluntarily shutting down 50% of your country's brainpower, your economic engine. In the 21st century, where everything is driven by innovation and intelligence, that is just straight-up economic suicide. You can't win the race when you've benched half of your team. It's impossible.
Second, you've got this thing called the demographic paradox. And this one is wild. These regimes often push this idea of boosting the birth rate, right? We need more soldiers, more workers. But here's the kicker. It has the exact opposite effect. When women are denied control over their own lives in a state that's becoming more aggressive and unstable, they basically go on a social strike. Birth rates don't go up, they plummet. So that soldier factory ends up with no workers.
And it just gets worse from there. By silencing women who are so often connected to the real on-the-ground stuff like schools and hospitals, the state develops institutional blindness. It literally can't see what's actually happening in the country anymore. Merit gets thrown out the window for personal loyalty, creating a closed club where corruption runs rampant. And finally, the whole system falls into an extractive trap. It stops creating anything new and can only squeeze value out of what's already there. Until, well, there's nothing left to squeeze.
Okay, so the theory sounds pretty solid, right? But the source really drives it home with historical data, showing this clear pattern across all sorts of different countries and decades. Let's just run through a few quick then versus now snapshots.
First up, Iran. You look back to the 1970s, when women's rights were expanding, and you see the fastest-growing economy in the region. Now, fast forward to after the 1979 Islamic Revolution rolled all of that back. What's the result? A massive brain drain, decades of economic hardship, and the constant protests we see today, led by women.
Or take Egypt.
From the 1920s to the 60s, it was known as the Paris on the Nile. Women were entering the workforce, it was a cultural hub, a real leader. But as women were gradually pushed out of public life, the economy just seized up. The source calls it a zombie system. And that stagnation ultimately boiled over into the revolution in 2011.
Russia is a really interesting case because you can see this pendulum swing back and forth. In the 1920s, the USSR grants women full rights, and it helps fuel this massive industrialization. But look at the pattern this analysis points to. In 1936, Stalin bans abortion. And what comes right after? The Great Terror and World War II. Now jump to the present. In 2017, Russia decriminalizes domestic violence. And what happens a few years later? The 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The argument is clear. A step back into traditionalism is a direct prelude to aggression.
And the pattern just keeps popping up. Turkey pulls out of a treaty on women's safety, and it's followed by an economic collapse. China starts pushing women to give birth for the party, and it happens right as its economy hits a major wall. And then you have the most extreme case, Afghanistan, where removing the female module entirely has resulted in a state that simply cannot function on its own.
So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, the analysis gives us something really practical. It's basically a dashboard of warning lights, a checklist you can use to see just how stable or unstable any state's architecture really is.
Here they are, the 5 big red flags that a system has entered what the source calls liquidation mode. Number 1, the state basically sanctions violence in the home by decriminalizing it. 2, it starts attacking reproductive rights, a clear sign it stopped caring about developing human capital and just wants to produce bodies. 3, you see smart, educated women fleeing from important fields like science and government. 4, it becomes deaf to calls for safety and basic rights, cutting off its own feedback loops. And 5, it digs back into old, archaic dogmas because its modern software just can't handle reality anymore. See, these aren't just policies, they're system error messages.
And that brings us to the final, essential question this whole analysis forces us to ask. A question we should probably ask when we look at any society, including our own. It's a really simple question, but according to this argument, the answer tells you everything you need to know. Is the canary still singing,